The return to New Lisburn. New Lisburn was often described as a paradise. It was a planet so Earth-like that it seemed almost surreal. A place where farmers and ranchers could thrive, where temperatures were mild and the weather predictable. The land stretched out before you, covered in lush fields of colorful flowers and crops, with rivers that gleamed like glass under the sun's gentle rays. It was a place where the stress of intergalactic politics and war seemed far removed, a place of peace and simplicity. Snow was rare except in the polar regions, and rain fell in gentle, evenly distributed patterns that kept the soil fertile and the crops abundant. Most of the people who settled on New Lisburn were seeking an escape from the chaos of the wider galaxy. They were looking for a quieter life, away from the busy spaceports and the constant flow of traffic. For them, New Lisburn offered the perfect opportunity, a paradise where they could live in harmony with nature, free from the pollution and pressures of more industrialized worlds. This world, with its green fields and sparkling lakes, was what they called home. And to them, it truly was a paradise. But paradise had its own set of challenges, one that often went unnoticed by the outsiders who visited. While the planet was idyllic, its gravity was a different story. It was heavier than most human-settled planets, closer to the gravity of Terra, and it posed a problem for visitors from lighter gravity worlds. The strain was intense for any species not adapted to such pressure, and many struggled to survive. The gravity was enough to crush the unprepared, and while the Republic had supplied personal gravity devices, PGDs, for those who needed them, it was still a significant deterrent for any long-term visitors. For most, that was the reason New Lisburn wasn't crowded with alien species. The only ones who ever seemed to make regular visits were the Star Sailors, the human allies who had been instrumental in humanity's rise to prominence in the galaxy. These beings, known for their affinity with space travel and their ability to withstand heavier gravities, had no problem navigating New Lisburn's surface. And the looters, a small semi-aquatic species, visited primarily for the fishing and the attention they received from the humans. But other than that, the planet remained relatively isolated, untouched by the outside world. For Nancy Blair, a native of New Lisburn, the daily routine was familiar. She spent her mornings tending to her herb garden, clipping fresh rosemary and basil, watching the sun rise over the horizon. Her life was simple and peaceful. She didn't expect any interruptions. It was just another day on the quiet planet, until the figures appeared on the horizon. Nancy was standing in her garden, pulling up a handful of fresh mint, when she heard the familiar sound of boots crunching on the gravel path. The figure that emerged from the tree line was unfamiliar at first, but as the others appeared from behind him, it became clear who they were. Soldiers. They wore the distinctive blue uniforms of the Republican Naval Infantry, a sight that sent a chill down Nancy's spine. She stood frozen for a moment, feeling her heart race. 1,000 thoughts ran through her mind, none of them comforting. She had known soldiers would eventually come to New Lisburn. There had been whispers of troop movements in the past, but she never imagined this would happen today. The men walked steadily towards her, their footsteps heavy, their faces obscured by dark helmets. Yet, despite the distance, she knew who they were. One figure, clearly in front of the group, walked with an uneven gait, his movements stiff but purposeful. Nancy's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the figure's broad shoulders, even though they were encased in armor and battle gear. Her breath caught in her throat. The face beneath the helmet was hidden, but she didn't need to see it to know who it was. She would never forget him. Johnny. Johnny had been the man who had captured her heart, the one who had left this peaceful world to fight in the distant wars that humanity had waged for so long. He had been strong, full of life, with eyes that had shone as gray as the sea and a smile that could light up even the darkest days. But now, as the soldiers drew nearer, Nancy's mind raced with fear. Her Johnny, the man she had once known so well, was no longer the same. She could tell even from the distance. The body language of the man she had once loved was now twisted, awkward, mechanical. The soldiers approached her garden gate, their movements sharp and disciplined. She could see their helmets reflecting the sunlight, their postures tense. One of them, a man who seemed slightly smaller than the rest, stepped forward and lowered his helmet just enough for Nancy to see his eyes. The cold, metal eyes of a soldier who had seen too much. "Do you bring me news of him?" Nancy asked, her voice trembling. Her question hung in the air like a weight she couldn't lift. Her gaze never left the figure in front of her. As she took another step forward, the man who had been walking stiffly now stopped. Johnny stepped forward. "I stand before ye, lass," came the familiar voice, but it was strained. The words were too familiar, but his voice was different now. Rough, like it had been twisted by the war. His smile was crooked, but it was still there, like a remnant of the man he had once been. Nancy's heart sank as she took a step back. The figure before her was Johnny, but not Johnny. The man she once knew was gone, replaced by something that barely resembled him. Something that was part human and part machine. The cyborg standing before her had the same build, the same voice, but everything else was alien, unfamiliar. Johnny reached out, lifting a trembling hand to her face, but his movement was slow, controlled. His fingers were no longer his own. His skin had been replaced by metal plating, his eyes hollow, the empty sockets staring out into the world. Nancy took another shaky step backward. The tears started to build up, but she couldn't stop them. The man she had once loved had come home, but he wasn't the same. The cost of return. Nancy Blair's heart beat in a rhythm she couldn't control, a rapid thudding that seemed to fill the peaceful garden with a sense of unease. The flowers she had so carefully tended, the colors, the fragrances, the life she had cultivated here, suddenly seemed to mock her. What use was all of it when the man she loved was standing before her, broken beyond recognition? Johnny's voice, once filled with warmth and promise, now reverberated in her ears like a distant echo. His words, "I stand before ye, lass," felt too much like a farewell, too much like the words of a man who had already left this world behind and returned to something else entirely. She couldn't move. Her limbs felt heavy, and she was terrified that if she blinked, he would vanish again, just another ghost of the past, slipping through her fingers like sand. The Johnny she knew had always been full of life, vibrant and full of mischievous energy. His laugh had been infectious, his touch warm. She could still remember the way his hands had once held hers, firm and sure, as if nothing in the universe could stand in their way. And now, standing before her, was a shell of the man she had loved, a stranger wrapped in the tattered remains of his humanity. The soldiers who had accompanied him kept their distance, watching in silence as the painful reunion unfolded. One of them, a smaller, wiry man, shifted uneasily, his face hidden behind a dark helmet, but Nancy could tell that he was uncomfortable. The rest of the group seemed to have adopted the kind of stoic professionalism that only soldiers who had seen too much could maintain. Nancy, on the other hand, was anything but composed. She wanted to scream, to ask them what had happened to Johnny, but the words wouldn't come. I don't understand, Johnny," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Where are your eyes? Where is the man I knew? The one who would joke and laugh with me? How can you still be you?" Johnny's face, what was left of it, twisted slightly in what could have been a smile, though it looked more like a grimace. The cyborg implants that replaced his eyes were cold and unyielding, their orange hue glowing faintly. He reached up with a trembling hand as if to explain, but his fingers, now mechanical, moved in a way that felt wrong. He hesitated before speaking again, his voice rough and tinged with regret. "I took an acid blast to the face, lass," Johnny said, his voice struggling to keep steady. "To protect ye. It took more than my face. It took my sight, my features, most of me. But I'm still here. In these new parts, they fixed me up as best they could." He paused for a moment, as if gathering himself, and then continued. I asked them to keep me whole, but not too whole. I didn't want to burden you with the design phase. You deserved a proper life, Nancy." Nancy's breath caught in her chest, and she looked away for a moment, trying to steady herself. The air felt too thin, the warmth of the sun that once comforted her now suffocating. Her mind raced, torn between the need to hold on to the man she once knew and the harsh reality that the man before her was not him. Not fully. "Where are your legs, Johnny?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet the words felt like knives in the air. "How can we ever run together now?" Johnny's response was not what she expected. He grinned crookedly, and despite the brokenness of his smile, there was a trace of his old humor there. "I can run, lass. I've got new legs. They'll carry us, just fine." He gestured to his new prosthetics, the metal limbs that had replaced the ones lost in the blast. "No more sideways shuffling. I asked them to do them, so they don't get cold," he added with an attempt at humor, though it was clear the words were tinged with sadness. Nancy's hands trembled as she stepped closer, trying to steady herself. Her eyes scanned Johnny's body, now a confusing blend of human and machine, and she felt the overwhelming weight of it all. Johnny was alive. He was standing before her, but at what cost? What remained of the man she had once known? What had the war taken from him? And more than that, what had it taken from her? Suddenly, the soldiers around them shifted. One of them, an older man with a grizzled face and a written block full of awards, spoke. "Boris stepped on a mine," the soldier said in a gruff voice, lowering his gaze to the ground as if avoiding Nancy's eyes. "He's gone now. Johnny here. He kept us going, even after that. But he's changed, lass. We all have." Johnny, who had been silent for a moment, gave a slight nod. "It's true," he said softly, his voice full of weariness. "Boris didn't make it. I couldn't save him. But I kept going. I kept fighting for this. For you." His words were heavy, soaked with the burden of survival. Nancy took another hesitant step forward, her hands outstretched toward him. Her breath caught as she stared at the mangled figure before her heart torn between the impulse to embrace him and the overwhelming reality of his transformation. "Johnny," she whispered, "you were meant to come home whole." Whole. Johnny's eyes, if they could still be called eyes, glistened with something close to emotion, but it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness between them. He took a step back, as if trying to keep his distance, even though it was clear his body was still struggling to hold on to what little humanity it had left. "I'm sorry, lass," Johnny said quietly. "I'm sorry, but this is me now. I'm all that's left. I got my pay, my pension. Rosie will be proud of her dar. She can be proud of me now." He dropped to one knee, the heavy sound of metal clanging against the cobblestones breaking the silence. "Will you still take me?" he asked, the words trembling from his lips. "Will you take me, even if I'm broken?" Nancy's eyes filled with tears as she stepped forward, not sure whether to embrace him or run. She reached for his cold, metal hand, and without thinking, collapsed into his arms, the weight of everything crashing down upon her. The kiss of the sun on her skin, the warmth of her garden, the hum of the peaceful planet, all of it seemed so distant, so meaningless now in the face of what they had lost. "I'm sorry, Johnny," she whispered through her sobs. "I hardly knew you, but you're still here. You're still mine." In that moment, she realized that nothing would ever be the same. The war, the wounds, the losses, everything had changed. And yet there was something in Johnny's broken smile, in his hopeful gaze, that gave her a glimpse of what they could still have, even in this new harsh world. The two looters, alien guests who had accompanied Johnny, shifted awkwardly, trying to give the reunited couple some space. They exchanged uncomfortable glances and turned away, no longer wanting to intrude on this moment. The soldiers, too, seemed to retreat into themselves, their stoic expressions betraying the exhaustion and sorrow that weighed heavily on them. And as Nancy clung to Johnny, her heart torn between love and despair. She knew that the war had taken everything, yet in that very moment, it also offered them the chance to rebuild, a future reborn from the ashes. Nancy's world had always been a place of peace, a tranquil garden, the sun warming the earth, and the comforting knowledge that her life would remain unchanged. That was, until the war had taken Johnny from her. And now he had returned, not in the way she had hoped, but as something else, someone else, a shell of the man she had once loved, now reconstructed and altered, pieces of him replaced with cold metal and machines. Yet despite the scars of war that marred his body, Johnny was still here. But was he still the same? The weight of the moment hung between them like a storm cloud. Nancy stood in the garden, her hand gripping Johnny's cold, cybernetic arm, her eyes never straying far from the man who had returned from the battlefield a stranger. The questions that raced through her mind were tangled with emotion she couldn't quite put into words. Could she still love this version of him? Could they rebuild their future together, knowing that the past they'd once shared was gone? Would the man she had once known be lost forever in the wake of this mechanical stranger? Johnny's mechanical limbs hummed quietly as he slowly stood up from his knee. His body, though still strong, felt like a prison, as if the very essence of him was locked away behind the coldness of the cybernetics. But the eyes, the mechanical, glowing eyes, told a different story. They still held a hint of the man he had once been, a spark of humanity that refused to fade, even in the face of such drastic change. "You don't have to apologize, Johnny," Nancy said softly, her voice strained but steady. She took another tentative step closer to him, her eyes searching his face, desperately looking for any semblance of the man she had known. "You came back to me. That's all that matters." But it wasn't that simple, was it? The path ahead would not be easy. Johnny was different. His body a mixture of human and machine, his soul torn between the person he had been and the soldier he had been forced to become. The love they had shared would need to evolve, to adapt, in order to survive the transformation they both faced. And for Nancy, that evolution was terrifying. Johnny reached out and gently cupped Nancy's cheek with his cold hand, the contrast between his cybernetic skin and her warm flesh almost unbearable. His smile was still crook, but there was something in it that Nancy recognized. The Johnny she had once loved, the man who had made her laugh and held her through the darkest of nights. He was still there, buried deep within this new version of himself. "I didn't want this for you," Johnny murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to come back like this. I didn't want you to have to look at me like this." Nancy closed her eyes, resting her forehead against his chest. She could feel the quiet hum of his mechanical heart, a reminder that even though so much of him had changed, the essence of who he was remained. She could feel the warmth of his arms, the familiar embrace that had once comforted her, even though his limbs were now made of metal. "I've missed you, Johnny," Nancy whispered, her voice breaking. "I've missed you so much, but I won't let this change us. We'll find a way to make this work, together." The words came from a place deep within her heart. She didn't know how they would rebuild their lives, how they would navigate this new reality, but she knew one thing for sure: they couldn't do it alone. They would need each other, more than ever. The harsh reality of a changed world. But their reunion wasn't without its challenges. Nancy could feel the eyes of the soldiers on them. Soldiers who had come with Johnny. Soldiers who had fought alongside him in battles that seemed so far away from this peaceful world. The looters, the alien guests who had accompanied Johnny for moral support, shifted awkwardly, their small bodies out of place in the human village. They had seen too much, just as Johnny had, and their presence only underscored the brutal reality of the war that had raged across the galaxy. The looters had always been an enigma to Nancy. Their semi-aquatic nature made them stand out, their thin, watery bodies gliding effortlessly through water but stumbling awkwardly on land. Yet they were fiercely loyal to Johnny and the other soldiers, and in their own way, they had come to New Lisburn for the same reason. This was a place of peace, a refuge from the chaos of war. But even here, in this quiet village, the scars of battle followed them. One of the looters, a small creature with a body that resembled a slim eel, turned away, trying to give Johnny and Nancy some space. Its pale, bulbous eyes avoided the intimate moment they were sharing, as if the looter was uncomfortable with the rawness of human emotions. The other, a larger looter with a more compact build, simply stood still, his eyes scanning the horizon, his posture tense. There was a heavy silence in the air, a reminder that the world outside New Lisburn was far from peaceful. Johnny's voice cut through the quiet. "You know, they never understood why I came back here," he said, his words thoughtful, his eyes distant. "I could have stayed out there, out in the front lines. I could have kept fighting. But New Lisburn, this place, it's what I fought for. It's what I wanted to come back to. For you." Nancy looked up at him, her heart swelling with both love and sadness. The war had taken so much from them. Johnny's body, his sense of self, and, in a way, her own peace. But despite everything, he had returned. He had come back to her, even though it seemed like the universe had conspired to rip them apart. "We'll rebuild," Nancy said firmly, her voice stronger now. "This is our chance. A new beginning. Even if it's different, we'll figure it out. I won't let this change us. I can't." Johnny nodded slowly, the weight of his new form pressing down on him. "I'm not the same man you remember, Nancy. I'm not the one you fell in love with. I'm broken, in more ways than one." "But you're still here," Nancy replied, her hands resting on his chest. "And you're still mine. I love you, Johnny, even if everything has changed." Johnny's smile softened, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. For a moment, everything else faded away. The soldiers, the alien visitors, the endless battles, the destruction. There was only this moment of tenderness, of shared love. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, painful, and uncertain. But it was theirs. The road ahead. As the evening drew near, the village began to settle into the quiet rhythm of the night. The stars slowly began to emerge in the sky, their light glimmering over the peaceful landscape. The soldiers, the looters, and the others gathered around the small inn, their silhouettes cast against the backdrop of the idyllic world they had arrived on. But for Johnny and Nancy, the world had changed. The future was uncertain. The war had torn them apart, but it also offered them a chance to rebuild, to forge something new in a world that seemed so fragile. There were still so many questions, so many unknowns, but together they would face them. Together they would make their way forward, even in a world that was irrevocably changed. Johnny might not have come home the way Nancy had hoped. He might have come back broken, altered, and scarred, but he was still here. And for now, that was enough.